Hi, everyone. I'll start with an introduction. It's my pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Cindy Regnier of Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. She's the technical leader for commercial building systems and the executive manager of the Flex Lab, which is a series of experimental test beds dedicated to integrated and low carbon building and the research and development of distributed energy resources and grid systems integration. Prior to joining Berkeley Lab in 2009, Cindy spent more than 13 years on the design of innovative integrated HVAC systems, including AIA Code Top 10 LEED Platinum buildings and a 200,000 square foot carbon neutral science museum. She holds professional engineering licenses in California, in the US, and Ontario, Canada. Today, Cindy will talk about connected communities, a $61 million multi-year program from the US Department of Energy. And with that, I will hand it over to Cindy.
Thank you, Laura. It's my pleasure to be here, and good morning, everyone. I'm here to talk to you today about connecting communities with grid interactive buildings and integrated distributed energy resources. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but I'll explain what I mean by that. So first, just a little bit of background on why this program exists and what some of the challenges are with our changing energy landscape, and how that's informing research that the Department of Energy is doing in this space. So on the slide, you can see there's several energy trends and challenges that are emerging. I'll go through them one by one, but the first being that there is increasing energy usage and renewable energy production, which is the renewable energy production increase is a great thing. However, it now affords us the opportunity to optimize how the grid performs so that we can make best use of those renewable energy supplies when they're available. We also have the emerging problem of having a history of deferred infrastructure investments in our national power grid. The opportunity there is certainly to modernize the grid and to ready it for this new diverse mix of power supplies, and to better meet the needs of occupants as well and customers. Another emerging energy trend is around smart controls for buildings. So that may be things like your smart thermostat in your home, or a connected water heater, smart appliances, and so on. This affords us the opportunity to make buildings more responsive, both to occupant needs and also to the grid and how it performs. We also have a suite of increased electric vehicle energy usage, which certainly has its benefits. And we also have an electrifying truck fleets and electrification of vehicles in general. The opportunity there is to coordinate how those vehicles are charged and to coordinate their load with grid conditions, to lower emissions overall and to facilitate lowered operating costs for the occupant or the customer as well. So grid interactive efficient buildings, or GEBs as they're sometimes referred to, have a strong role to play in this emerging energy landscape. We can integrate how these buildings operate with this growing share of variable renewable energy and help support how the grid operates to help stabilize and optimize the use of renewable energy when it's available. Grid interactive efficient buildings also can play a role in reducing the demand on the power grid, and consequently can help reduce costs to upgrade aging or electrical infrastructure system components, and in general improve system reliability as a result. Grid interactive efficient buildings also can play a role in achieving decarbonization goals, both behind the meter at the building scale, but it also through its relationship potentially with the grid and how it's behaving, and helping the grid to operate in a more optimized, lower carbon manner as well. So buildings can play a role in electrifying and increasing heating electrification in general, but also can interact with the grid to say when we use that energy so that we can help optimize the use of renewable energy. And then last but certainly not least, and actually quite important to the success of GEBs, are the ability of grid interactive efficient buildings to optimize energy use based on customer preferences. That can be making sure that comfort is maintained, but it can also speak to energy cost concerns, and lowering energy costs overall. So overall, you can see that GEBs can provide flexible building loads that can benefit both owners, occupants, and the electric grid. And the research that we need to do is to develop strategies, technologies, and controls that can help offer all of these things successfully. GEBs are characterized with 4 particular aspects. The first is efficiency. Efficiency is not going away. It's quite important to reduce the capacity and demand on the grid overall in a consistent, stable manner. So it minimizes demand, and it's still thinking about efficient HVAC systems, lighting systems, and so on. We also want devices and systems to be connected. So we want two-way communication to be enabled between devices at the building scale and systems, and also renewable energy systems, battery storage, and the grid conditions in general. And that enables us to then take the next steps of having smart controls. So looking at analytics to support the co-optimization of both efficient energy use, flexibility, while always taking into account occupant preferences. And then last but not least, GEBs incorporate flexibility. So flexible loads that can be used to shift when energy is used, or shed when energy is used, or modulate that energy use in order to again, optimize for energy costs, but also lowered emissions and other grid benefits. Overall, GEBs advance the role of buildings in relationship to the grid by utilizing efficient building design and operational strategies that are highly efficient and innovative, but they're also coupled with these smart technologies to enable more sophisticated levels of building energy management. We're overall trying to dynamically manage our buildings now, not just to meet a single set point and maintain comfort overall, but also more dynamically in response to grid conditions, price signals, how much the building energy is actually being used and where it's coming from, whether you're producing renewable energy on site, whether you have a battery and how you use it in discharging to supply the building, or perhaps you're providing a service back to the grid and using that battery power in that way. But we always want to also incorporate this feedback from the occupant side to maintain comfort and productivity overall. And we also want to co-optimize with these distributed energy resources, which I'll describe in a second, and with microgrids in the building. So buildings are one element of it, but the distributed energy resources play another key role in terms of energy consumption and use. So what do we mean when we talk about distributed energy resources? The most typical ones that you're likely to see in a building would be solar photovoltaic panels behind the meter usually. Electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Typically, this is a one-way connection where the electric vehicle is just taking energy from the grid, but there is an emerging area of bidirectional electric vehicle charging where the car can be used as a power supply to the building or perhaps to the grid, and under different conditions. And then there's battery storage behind the meter usually as well. So typically these DERs are either at the building scale, or they could be community resources centralized. And they can provide this immediate electric or power needs that can be used to reduce demand at the building scale or to supply power back to the grid. It should be connected to the distribution system close to the load that it's trying to support, and with the majority of the produced energy consumed within a community or at the building. There are some other examples of distributed energy resources that are less common at the building or community scale, and those include wind, combined heat and power plants, demand response, which is an automated system to shed energy consumption from various devices, microgrids, and energy efficiency is also considered a distributed energy resource in that it has a role to play in consistently reducing energy consumption. So we're going to talk about connected communities. I'm going to define that term first. So far, we've been mostly talking about single buildings and how their grid interactive benefit can support the grid. But a connected community is a group of these grid interactive efficient buildings with diverse flexible end use equipment and other DERs that collectively work to maximize building community and grid efficiency. So essentially in the utility scale, in order for the grid to receive consistent, reliable benefits to the point where it can optimize and stabilize how renewable energy is used consistently, you need to have a certain minimum threshold of reliable power that can be shed or shifted. And single buildings may not be able to provide that. In most cases, they probably won't. So you need a group of buildings and these DERs working collectively in a coordinated way to provide that minimum level of service to help influence the grid and how it's behaving. So the US Department of Energy has recognized that these connected communities are an important part to realizing the real benefit of these flexible loads and flexible DERs and how they support the utility infrastructure and to realize those benefits. So they've launched a 5-year research program funded by multiple DOE offices, including the Vehicle Technology Office, Solar Energy Technologies, Building Technologies, and the Office of Electricity, to support 10 demonstration projects across the US. It's a $61 million program. And the awards were recently announced at the end of last year that are going to be studied. In some cases, a project has multiple community locations. So that's why you see more than 10 pins on the map there. Specifically, we were very interested in making sure that there was a diversity of representation in terms of geography and climate being one condition. But there also is a diversity in terms of utility mix. There's going to be a lot of differences in terms of power supply mix and regulatory environments and what challenges each of those areas are going to have and what solutions they'll need to really maintain the success of this approach. So a variety of different geographies and regions was desired, but we also wanted to target a range of different building types. So residential single-family homes are represented in some communities. Some are multifamily homes. We have commercial offices in some cases. We have at least one educational campus that's in the mix, and also industrial facilities. So these all represent different types of load profiles, different types of flexible building loads that will be of interest. And we also are targeting both existing buildings and some new constructions. So we'll have a varying difference in terms of energy use intensity depending upon the age of the building. And that has some implications as well in terms of how much demand flexibility they can offer to the grid at a given moment. So the goals of this research program are a few. The first is really around just demonstrating how groups of buildings combined with these distributed energy resources or connected communities can reliably and cost effectively serve as grid assets by strategically deploying efficiency and demand flexibility. So these are demonstration projects, but as you'll see in a few slides, it's a unique program in that there is a lot of research and development supporting the success of these demonstrations through LBNL's role in the program. Our expected outcome is to enable increased energy efficiency, reduced energy demand on the grid, and to reduce environmental impact. But these are not the only outcomes that we're going to be studying across these demonstrations. And in fact, this is a multifaceted, multidisciplinary area of work because so much needs to be brought together simultaneously for the success of these approaches. I'm going to talk a little bit about the specifics of the program and the types of grid issues and grid services that the program is trying to tackle. So this is a little bit perhaps in the weeds on utility needs and grid issues, but they're important to understanding the variability in terms of controls approaches that are needed in addressing some of the different issues that the grid has. I've been talking a lot so far about variable renewable energy generation. That is a very key grid issue that is emerging throughout the country. As we get more and more renewable energy supply as part of our power supply mix, in general, that creates a more variable power supply profile. And so we need strategies to manage that and maintain a stable consistent amount of energy that can be supplied to buildings. And buildings can play a role in reducing energy use when variable energy production curtails due to, say, the sun going down or wind becoming less prevalent. There's other grid issues, though, that the program is interested in, and those include resource adequacy, maintaining enough capacity in the electrical system to meet the needs of the varying buildings and communities. Resiliency is becoming a bigger and bigger issue for communities as we have power disruption events due to climatic events or other issues in the power system. And these having more demand flexibility and distributed energy resources closer to your home or your business can provide resiliency benefits as well. And so that's being studied throughout the program. There is another issue of capital investments needed in generation, transmission, or distribution grid infrastructure improvements. In some cases, perhaps an area of a city has experienced a lot of growth and a lot of increase in electrical demand in a certain distribution area, perhaps constraining the electrical infrastructure, and maybe requiring an increase in service and large capital investment to allow for that. Well, we're going to be studying how these approaches can help defer those investments or maybe negate them by lowering demand and managing demand better within the capacity that it currently exists. There's also issues around maintaining voltage limits on transmission and distribution system. And as we put more renewable energy on the grid, that's a different power quality. And so these connected communities can also provide grid services to help manage those voltage conditions. And then another grid issue is around getting the grid back up and running after a power outage event. And so the connected communities can then look at providing things like coordinated islanding or providing black start or other recovery related services to the grid. So these are just a few of the grid issues rather, that the program is trying to help address. As part of the program, we required the applicants to provide certain kinds of grid services to address these. The first one being one we've talked about already, about supporting the increased integration of renewable energy resources. That was a must for a grid service for these communities, but then we said you needed to at least provide one more, address one more grid issue in addition to this that's relevant to transmission or distribution. So a minimum of 2 grid services are required. They had to also incorporate some level of resilience into their connected community designs and an enhanced ability to recover from power outages. And then the last thing is we required a certain amount of load flexibility through these programs. Again, I mentioned earlier that there's a minimum threshold of demand flexibility that the utility needs in order to be able to consistently manage how they maintain power to their customer base. And each wholesale electrical market throughout the US has a different minimum threshold, but in general, 150 megawatts was roughly what we suggested was perhaps a minimum threshold for some parts of the grid service conditions. We also encouraged projects to address more than 2 grid issues and to provide more than 2 grid services to address those grid issues. We also encourage them to look at scaling or staging community energy supply or consumption using load control, storage, and/or generation in order to operate the community at different levels of service during multi-day power outages. So perhaps understanding what critical loads are in those communities and enabling operation of the community at a reduced capacity to get through those power outage events. I'm going to talk a little bit about Berkeley Lab's role in this program for the next few slides. As I mentioned, there's about 10 awardees across the US with a variety of different demonstration sites. We're playing the role of national coordinator across this program, and our scope is including about 4 major areas of work. The first one is around evaluation. So each of these demonstrations will be evaluated. We're at the very beginnings of this program. And so we're creating standardized evaluation methods and data collection standards so that each of the projects can be evaluated in completion plans and supporting the teams in applying the evaluation methods. We'll also be conducting some quality assurance reviews and cross-cutting analysis. I mentioned earlier, this is a very multidisciplinary program, and so our evaluation topics are pretty diverse. We definitely are going to be studying how the customer's experiences with these programs, if their comfort's maintained, their productivity is being maintained, and so on. And varying impacts, both quantitative and more qualitative. So we'll be looking at things like energy cost impacts as part of that. We're also definitely going to be studying the grid services that are provided and their energy impacts. So that's a pretty large topic. We're going to be looking at specific grid service events and conditions when they're being provided, but also looking at annual performance as well in terms of overall did the community, how much energy did it save, and how did it, and during those grid service periods, were there other impacts to overall energy use? Business models is another area that we're going to be looking at. So there is a unique aspect to these in that we need an aggregator to help coordinate control across these communities to collectively provide the amount of grid services to meet that minimum threshold I mentioned. So that aggregation approach is it's not completely brand new, but there's a relatively small market for it currently. And so understanding the business model there and the costs and the what it would take to replicate that business at some scale is going to be another area of evaluation. And then cost benefit analysis, that's going to be done across each of the major stakeholders of the work. So from the customer's perspective, the utilities perspective, from the perspective of the aggregator, and so on. And then we have a greenhouse gas emission evaluation that'll be done across the year. And we'll also be evaluating different aspects of resilience. So not just from the power supply end of things, but also thermal resilience. You know, are these buildings and communities able to kind of ride through events without some level of power and maintain comfort levels needed for occupancy? So evaluation is one big aspect of our role. We're also going to be providing technical assistance in general. We want these demonstrations to be a success. So our technical assistance could be from a technology or controls aspect, but also we have expertise in utility program and rate design and other aspects of implementing these types of approaches. We'll also be supporting some cross-cutting R&D to support the projects. And I have a couple slides that will illustrate the topics that we'll be focusing on there. Another key aspect is we want to synthesize the project's lessons learned and best practices, and really keep an eye on how we can support replicability of these approaches. So the cross-cutting analysis will be done across the projects, and we'll be developing case studies and other resources to enable replication. And last but not least, we definitely are going to be interested in national stakeholder outreach and engagement, again, with an eye towards replication. So utilities will be a big area of focus, but also building owners, customers, manufacturers, these aggregator companies and controls companies as well. Some aspects of what we could be doing for cross-cutting analysis include things like estimating the at-scale delivery costs. So we recognize these are all one-off pilots in specific areas under specific conditions, but we want to be able to try and generalize these results and help others see how they could take steps to replicate and what the benefits and costs would be. So one aspect of our analysis will be looking at taking into account specifics of these demonstrations and trying to generalize from them. We also want to understand if perhaps there are other benefits that these projects have that we hadn't thought of initially, perhaps then further improving the value of these approaches, and to the extent we can quantify them and document them so they can be replicated. We want to assess the viability of these solutions for other regions. Best practices will be of interest, and then they'll be doing additional analysis on the evaluation topics beyond what we're asking the individual projects to do, include things like the grid's financial benefits from having these projects applied, other things related to greenhouse gas benefits and so on. And then there could be some additional future state analysis. So the power supply and the grid as it exists today is not what it will be in 5 or 10 years. And so under those emerging varied grid conditions, how do the cost benefits, et cetera, change over time? And the awardee teams are going to be supporting all of this effort by providing LBNL with data to support all of these analyses. Some cross-cutting R&D that we're looking at includes interoperability. That's going to be key in order to get the coordinated controls across these varying devices and the coordinated controls aggregator. Cybersecurity and data privacy. So that's another key aspect. How do we ensure that the minimum amount of data that's needed to support these coordinated controls is captured and not excess amounts of data beyond that? And what are good cybersecurity frameworks to be able to implement these approaches? So our role is going to be creating templates for approaches here, technical assistance, and developing other resources to support their rollout. We have 2 other cross-cutting R&D areas, at least within the first year and probably a little bit beyond. One is around occupant engagement and the other is around recruitment and equity. There was a strong component to the project awards to require some diversity in terms of the buildings that will be incorporated into these into these connected communities. And so low and moderate income is actually a pretty strong representation across many of the projects. And in one case, there's also an LGBTQ focus. So our role is to help support the recruitment aspects and supporting community outreach and engagement through networking, outreach materials. And we will be developing resources for best practices to engage these underserved communities as well. But then after recruitment, there's an area of occupant engagement and helping to provide guidance in targeting who would be a likely good candidate for success in accepting grid services. Guidance in how to engage with occupants, best practices and lessons learned there as well. So I'm going to give about 4 examples of connected communities as the last set of slides here. The first 2 were our existing connected communities, and at the time of writing, we don't have data, so I'd love to be able to give you performance data, but that will be something that we'll be tracking and following up on over time. So the first 2 are already up and operating. The first one's in Basalt, Colorado. It's 12 new construction residences, duplex and triplex. This is the first all-electric net zero community in rural Colorado. The DERs include rooftop PV, battery storage. They also have electrified heating and domestic hot water through use of heat pumps. And they have EV chargers as well. And so they have smart controls embedded to optimize behind the meter flexible loads and align them with PV production. So they're trying to make best use of PV production on site when it's available. But they're also using those flexible loads in each of these buildings to shed, shift, or modulate to accommodate the grid conditions as they occur. And things like trying to reduce peak demand and reduce the need for extra capacity on the grid. The next existing connected community, and there's only maybe about 6 at most of these across the US currently, and hence the reason for a new program with DOE to kind of expand that cohort and learn further. The next one's at Georgia Tech. It consisted of 18 buildings on their campus. This one uses a model-based approach to manage and co-optimize the building flexible loads with the DERs. HVAC is a pretty strong aspect of what's being used in terms of flexible loads for grid services. And here they're using real-time pricing. Real-time pricing can be a good proxy for understanding when the grid would like you to use less energy. For example, if the price increases significantly, that's a good condition, like in peak conditions that, you know, you're really using the top threshold of capacity of the system network, and therefore it makes sense for a building to try to reduce demand in those conditions. They're also going to be evaluating the dispatch of these flexible loads for energy cost and carbon reduction optimization. They also are looking at evaluating what different efficiency measures or cost-effective measures can be also incorporated to reduce carbon emissions and energy efficiency and demand flexibility, not just with the building, but also with the central physical plant that exists on campus. The next two are awardees under the new Department of Energy program. The first is a rural project of single-family homes spread across two states, Maine and New Hampshire. There's a retrofit of 450 single-family homes and up to 60 commercial buildings across 3 connected communities in these 2 states. The DERs are also electric batteries, EV chargers, and PV. And the flexible loads are heat pump based HVAC and hot water heaters. A couple of the statistics on this project include the New Hampshire has demand flexibility based on 250 installed batteries with a 10 kW capacity or 27 kilowatt hour. And another unique aspect is in Maine, the demand flexibility controls will be used to manage HVAC load and peaks in the winter. Sort of an emerging thing that's been happening. Historically, you would imagine, utility grids are most strained during the summer when air conditioning loads are highest. But as buildings electrify and we see, heat pump based heating for HVAC and hot water, condition for the grids, and in some parts of the country will be a higher peak than the summer conditions. So in Maine, the demand flexibility controls are going to really be focusing in on winter-based peak reduction with HVAC in mind. So this is the first effort to really test transactive energy at the hundreds building scale with a mix of DERs in a rural context. And they're targeting about an additional 16% energy efficiency savings, predominantly through weatherization efforts, and up to 7.5 megawatts of flexible load total. And then the next new project out of the DOE program is for the city of Madison, Wisconsin. And here it's a retrofit of 5 to 6 city buildings, as well as 10 commercial and industrial buildings in the downtown core. The DERs also include PV batteries and managed EV charging for a fleet of 40 vehicles. The flexible loads are predominantly HVAC, but also lighting and automated demand response in the buildings. And here the demonstration is going to be focusing on decreased curtailment and disconnect times, and also increased power quality. So again, looking at this issue of voltage variability with renewable energy becoming a bigger part of the power mix. A couple of the targets for this project include peak load shed of 20% for lighting and 10% for HVAC, and a total of 600 kW of flexible load. So these are pretty significant projects in terms of the amount of load flexibility that they're really managing. And with that, that concludes the slides I had planned for today. I want to encourage you to check out our website, connectedcommunities.lbl.gov or cc.lbl.gov. The website is actually meant to be a resource for all things GEB. And so it's not just going to be highlighting the actual case studies for the projects out of this program, but we also have a wide variety of resources that we're continuously updating to help all variety of stakeholders in understanding the opportunity and how best practices and resources to be able to implement a similar strategy. So we do have policy related documents, utility program related guidance, but also technical resources, as well as guidance for users, providers, and operators. There's case studies on the website, as well as we'll have events posted and a newsletter that you're welcome to sign up for on the site as well. With that, I think I'd love to open it up for questions. So I have not been looking at the Q&A as we've been talking here.
Hi, Cindy. Thank you so much for that excellent overview on the connected communities. I can start reading off some of the questions too that have come in through the Q&A and chat. The first one is, will the slides be made available? So yes, If you go to the event page in for BEST, under the expo or the auditorium, and this is probably the way that you got to the talks, there's a link to all of the presentations for all of the speakers right underneath the abstract or description for the talk. So yes, these slides are available on the site already. Question for you, Cindy. The first one was, who would be responsible for the operation and management of a connected community? And how do you sustain the operation and ensure the benefits are equitably distributed?
It's a great question. So I mentioned this aggregator role a little bit in the slides. I think there's two answers to this. One answer is it depends on the nature of the community. In some cases, these communities do have a central organizing organization, such as an academic institute who might be running a campus, or it might be a series of multifamily buildings in a residential community that has a central like HOA. So there can be some central organizing aspect there, but it's not required. The main thing that I think is of importance for these types of approaches is to have some entity that's interested in engaging with the individual buildings, the occupants and customers, and providing a program that offers benefits to them. They could be financial benefits, through energy cost savings, greenhouse gas emission reductions, and so on. And that they would manage the coordinated controls across that community. So they're a controls provider, but they're also this aggregator and have an outreach and engagement aspect that I think is a bit unique. And that second part of that question is around how do you sustain operation and ensure benefits are equitably distributed? That's a great question too. I do think that's an area of research. How do we maintain persistent performance over time? I do think there probably will be likely an aspect of this aggregator's role that will be around retro-commissioning, or reviewing the controls and making sure that they perform consistently over time. And as we're all aware, over time, buildings do tend to need maintenance and some retuning to allow for maintained, consistent performance. So I do think that's going to be an area of attention. And then the last part of that about ensuring benefits are equitably distributed. That's a very, very important one. I think one of the reasons why DOE required that was interested in having some of the projects be in disadvantaged communities, because typically they don't tend to be the ones that are don't have the resources typically to install these types of technologies and benefit from them. But there are a lot of different business models about how this could be applied, including ones where the utility might own the DERs and they may or may not be installed behind the meter. They could be front of the meter resources. The aggregator could serve a role in actually owning some of the equipment, like a hot heat pump water heater, and have a business relationship where they share in the benefits of how it's being operated. So I think our role is to ensure that we develop enough solutions that can cover the range of approaches that are needed to provide the equitable solutions that are needed to really address the variations in terms of how people have resources to access these types of solutions. I hope that answers.
There's actually quite a few questions that are coming in, and this session ends at 9, but we are coming on a break. If it's okay, I think maybe we can go a couple more minutes, and then I also want to encourage attendees and Cindy, if you have the time, to go into the LBNL booth where they can chat with you if that's possible, if there's any other questions that we can't address here during the session.
Sure, I'm happy to stay a little longer.
Okay, great. The next question then is, can you describe some of the different configurations of stakeholders and partners in these projects and relate these stakeholders to their separate business models?
I think I alluded to a few of the different ones in that my previous answer, actually.
Yeah.
I think I didn't mention utilities as much in that, though. I think that there are different configurations where the utility plays a stronger role in terms of the kind of program it's providing. So I think the utility could be one of those stakeholders that owns the connected smart heat pump water heater. Utility should be the one that has some kind of program to offer incentives, or at least some kind of rate structure that offers some benefit for when you shed or shift energy use. The aggregator, I think, is another key stakeholder here, and there can be a variety of different business models as to how they approach things. I think there's also energy as a service models that could be another area that emerges as a key stakeholder, companies that provide energy savings under a contract, and they having through a variety of means, could be installing new energy efficiency measures, but could also be running these coordinated controls and coordinating and with the utility programs as well.
There's also a few questions coming in related to specific collaborations and sites. Have you worked with the Illinois Institute of Technology in regards to smart grid research?
I personally have not, but I know that I work with hundreds of researchers, and they definitely have. I'm not sure if there's a more specific question around that.
If that audience member, Bob, if you want to clarify or elaborate on that, then please feel free to add it in chat. Specific to the Madison, Wisconsin project, are a couple of questions came in about that. Do you have a project contact for that project, and are there educational tours available for students over there?
Yeah, I can see if we can provide a contact for that project. At the moment, these projects are brand new, so they don't yet have, website presence or, tours available. I think it's going to take a little while before they have, results to share as well. But we're happy to try and put people in contact with them. And I will also say each of these, LBNL's role as a national coordinator is also to offer more in the way of stakeholder engagement, but the individual projects will also have plans, usually locally or regionally, to engage with key stakeholders. So there could easily be more engagement, that's opportunities that are available there too. I just can't recall off the top of my head.
And that kind of relates to Peter's couple of questions about who the owners are of these projects, and are they typically leveraging state, local, or private funding to continue?
Yeah, so it's a mixture. The owners of I guess what's the question? What is, Peter, maybe you could say a little bit more about who's the owner of the project. I mean, the prime applicant varies. It could be the educational institute. In the case of the Madison, Wisconsin project, it's actually a product vendor who's the main, the controls provider who's the main applicant, and we will be running the project for them. So in other cases, it may be a utility who's leading the effort, or it may be the building owners, or it could be the aggregator. So honestly, it's a very diverse set of approaches that you can use to kind of instigate an effort like this. Utilities could be the ones trying to enroll customers and get them up and running, and they could actually be the ones that run the coordinated controls. So far, it seems more likely that an outside third party is going to be the one that in this aggregator role rather than a utility.
Great. I think that covers the questions, unless I missed any in here. I really appreciate your time, Cindy, and also all of the audience members who've engaged in this session. We have another one coming up in 10 minutes, so I'll allow people to get some time to transition over there and take a quick break. Thank you so much, Cindy.
And I'll offer, I did include one new slide in this deck, so I'll offer an updated version to the organizers to post on the website in case there's going to be a minor difference between that deck and this one.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.